Hello, folks. This is Dr. Alexandria LeFay, and we're going to look at how to read a short story. I think we're all familiar with the physical act of reading a short story, but how many of you read it out loud? Well, if you don't by practice, consider giving it a try for this exercise. We're going to read a short story by Luisa Valenzuela called All About Suicide, which has been translated into English by Helen Lane. Here's an example of a short story that challenges what we think a story is going to be about, based on the way we traditionally read it. This particular story looks at the political realities of Argentina, also known as Argentina, in the 1960s. All About Suicide. Ismael grabbed the gun and slowly rubbed it across his face. Then he pulled the trigger, and there was a shot. Bang! One more person dead in the city. It's getting to be a vice. First, he grabbed the revolver that was in a desk drawer, rubbed it gently across his face, put it to his temple, and pulled the trigger without saying a word. Bang! Dead. Let's recapitulate. The office is grand, fit for a minister. The desk is ministerial too, and covered with a glass that must have reflected the scene, the shock. Ismael knew where the gun was. He'd hidden it there himself. So he didn't lose any time. All he had to do was open the right-hand drawer and stick his hand in. Then he got a good hold on it and rubbed it over his face with a certain pleasure before putting it to his temple and pulling the trigger. It was something almost sensual and quite unexpected. He hadn't even had time to think about it. A trivial gesture, and the gun had fired. There's something missing. Ismael in the bar, with a glass in his hand, thinking over his future act and its possible consequences. We must go back further if we want to get at the truth. Ismael in the cradle, crying because his diapers are dirty and nobody is changing him. Not that far. Ismael in the first grade, fighting with a classmate who one day become a minister, his friend, a traitor. No, Ismael in the ministry, without being able to tell what he knew, forced to be silent. Ismael in the bar with the glass, his third in his hand, and the irrevocable decision: better death. Ismael pulling the revolver at the entrance to the building, pushing the swinging door leading to the office section, saying good morning to the guard, opening the door of his office. Once in his office, 7 steps to his desk. Terror. The act of opening the drawer, taking out the revolver, and rubbing it across his face. Almost a single gesture and very quick. The act of putting it to his temple and pulling the trigger. Another act, immediately following the previous one. Bang. Dead. And Ismael coming out of his office, the other man's office, the minister's, almost relieved, even though he can predict what awaits him. Hopefully, I said at the beginning of this paragraph, Ismael pushing the revolving door at the entrance to the building. Sorry if I misspoke there. Now, let's look at how we might read a short story. First and foremost, we want to think about the literal meaning of the story, what actually happened. One of the interesting things about this short story is we're not quite sure. I also want to point out there may be some background noises of my cats sparring with each other, but I assure you, no cat has been injured in the making of this video. So when we look at All About Suicide, particularly with the introduction of the gun and the firing of that gun in the very first paragraph, we're thinking that Ismael killed himself, which is quite unusual to have a dead person narrating a story. It's been done before, I promise. But in reality, it is not Ismael who dies. It is, in fact, the minister who was a friend of Ismael's from first grade, a classmate who one day become a minister, because remember, the desk is ministerial, and a friend and a traitor. And that working within the very same ministry, Ismael knows the truth about this minister, this friend, this traitor, that he cannot tell anyone. So he decides death is better. In other words, he decides that what this man has done is so heinous and inexcusable that he has to take the man's life. Then it says, and Ismail coming out of his office, the other man's office, the minister's, he's relieved, even though he can predict what awaits him. And what awaits him is probably certain death. You see, in political regimes like the corrupt one in Argentina in the 1960s, oftentimes people of great power did horrible things, and then because of their power were able to hide it and maintain a normal, quote unquote, lifestyle despite their heinous acts. And here Ismail can no longer stand these kind of secrets, these traitors to their own people, that he takes the life of a minister in the same ministry where he himself works. And this man had once been a good friend. And so the short story ramps up in reverse, giving you a very bizarre opening that's horrific, but we're not sure exactly what happened. And as we get more and more information, suddenly the story makes more sense. I'd like to point out that one of the things Luisa Valenzuela is doing here is she is saying so often we make assumptions that we know what's going on in a story, in our lives, and the culture around us, but that oftentimes our understanding of what happened is based on false clues, false understanding of the truth. And it isn't until we dig deeper and learn more information that we truly know what happened. So, when we're looking at a short story, the first step is what actually happened. The second step, what is it trying to say about what happened? Oftentimes, we learn that by looking at specific clues within the story. For instance, in the opening paragraph, it says one more person dead in the city. It's getting to be a vice. There are quite a few sentences in this story that have a really dark sense of humor. For instance, when we go back further to look at the story, we see Ishmael in the cradle crying because his diapers are dirty. Wait, not that far. Another example of the same dark humor. I'd like to point out that this use of dark humor is an element called undercutting. This is where a writer uses humor or some other contrary or counterpointal word choice or literary element or tone to take some of the bite out of the darkness or strength of the emotion in the story. So here we have a very difficult story that is undercut by dark humor. So one of the elements used in this short story is undercutting. The other thing it uses is kind of a reverse engineering, in the sense that the dramatic thing happens in the beginning of the story, but we don't really understand the drama here until we learn more details a piece at a time. So it is actually the narrative structure of this story, the sequence of events in the story itself, that reveals some of the deeper meaning. Now, the actual occurrence of events is in a very different order than they're delivered in this story. So Valenzuela is intentionally changing the order of events to tell us something specific. So the question becomes, what is she trying to tell us? And one of the things that tells us what she's trying to get at is something she says in this paragraph here. We must go further back if we want to get at the truth. In other words, let's not accept just what's given to us at first. Let's look deeper into life, into culture, into people, to find out what's really going on. And what we find out is that the man who died is not Ismael, but his friend, someone he met in the first grade, who became a minister, a friend, and then a traitor. And Ismael was forced to be silent. This silence led him to take an action he wouldn't have otherwise taken, we see this phrase I had so much difficulty pronouncing, irrevocable decision. Irrevocable means that you can't undo it. Once it's done, he cannot do it. We also see that the sentence is all about suicide. And when we learn that the death in the beginning was not a suicide, but in fact the other man, the minister's, we wonder then why is the story called suicide? Well, then we realize that Ismail can predict what awaits him, that he himself will die. So by killing this minister, he has, in effect, killed himself. So it's an act of suicide. Which then raises the question, if he knew it was going to lead to his own death, then why did he do it? And the reason we find here, better death. In other words, it is better to have died taking out a man who has done horrible things than to go on living in silence with the lies of what this man has done. It raises a lot of questions about the nature of truth, the nature of what is good and what is evil. And Valenzuela is asking us to consider how we feel about these things and what we would do if we know an injustice has been done pardon me, and we're forced to keep it secret. So in reading a short story, first we read it for literal meaning. Then we ask ourselves, what is the deeper meaning of this story? What's the theme? The theme is a message conveyed about a topic. The topics here are death and truth and governmental corruption. What is Valenzuela saying about these things? How can we find this information? And the answer is by looking at the deeper meaning conveyed by the literary elements in the story. The two most important ones in this story are undercutting and the control of the narration of the plot or the order of events. And I hope this presentation has been helpful to you in being able to look a little deeper into reading short stories. And if you have any questions, feel free to let me know. Thank you, and signing out.